We have a very special program for you this evening. Not one, but three very fine authors, all journalists, all seasoned, intrepid war reporters. They've written memoirs and are here to discuss their experiences in Afghanistan, Syria, and other conflict zones. First, at my far right is Janine DiGiovanni, Newsweek's Middle East editor and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. At the start of her journalistic career, Janine covered the first Palestinian Intifada in the late 1990s. Since then, in the 1980s, I had 1980s, I don't know why I said 1990s. Since then, she's reported on turmoil and civil conflicts throughout the Middle East and beyond. In her latest book, The Morning They Came for Us, she chronicles the war in Syria. Using 7 different perspectives, she provides a vivid picture of a ravaged nation as experienced by its citizens. Among them, a nun, a doctor, a musician, and a student. Their stories convey the realities of modern urban warfare, from the pervasive smoke to the hunger, to the return of such previously vanquished diseases as typhus and polio. Next to Janine is Christina Lamb, currently the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times. Like Janine, Christina's introduction to conflict reporting also came in the late 1980s, but in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Her journalism has since taken her far and wide, including assignments in Brazil, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Iraq. But since the 9/11 attacks, she's spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan. She wrote I Am Malala, or co-wrote I Am Malala, with Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai. And her new book, Farewell Kabul, highlights the errors and miscalculations made by the United States and its allies in the war in Afghanistan, and argues that the world has been left more, not less, dangerous since 9/11. Our third author is Kim Barker, whose book, The Taliban Shuffle, about her reporting in Afghanistan and Pakistan, served as the basis for the recent movie Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, starring Tina Fey. Kim's first reporting jobs were with papers in Indiana and Washington State. After joining the Chicago Tribune in 2001, she ended up going abroad and spent 5 years from 2004 to 2009 as the Trib's South Asia bureau chief, based in New Delhi and Islamabad. She now writes for the New York Times. A Times review of her book called it both hilarious and harrowing, 2 contrasting adjectives that also sum up the frequently mixed experience of war reporting. Moderating discussion by this impressive group of panelists will be Mary Jordan, herself a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with The Washington Post. Mary was based abroad for 14 years in Tokyo, Mexico City, and London, and she's currently covering the presidential campaign. You need that foreign experience.
War reporting is easier.
She told me as we were walking in that she just interviewed Donald Trump today, so you might want to ask her about that. Anyway, we're sort of getting off track, aren't we? Mary's most recent book, which she co-wrote with her husband, Kevin Sullivan, also of the Washington Post, is titled Hope, a Memoir of Survival in Cleveland, and chronicle the kidnapping and torment of 2 of the women held captive in a home in Cleveland by Ariel Castro. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, I really feel like I'm having dinner at 3 different 5-star restaurants tonight. It's impossible to do justice to the careers of these 3 women, but we're sure going to have fun trying. And I see in the audience Bill Kovach, one of the great newsmen of our time, and the former head of the Neiman Foundation, the of journalists. And it's a testament to, is this working?
Yeah, it's working. We just gotta leave it.
It's a testament to all the work that you've done. I'm very proud to be up here on the stage. So I want to ask you first, before we get into other things, how did this happen? You know, other kids grow up and they want to run Facebook. Why did you want to go to war? You want to start?
Yeah, well, I never wanted to be a journalist. I was an academic, and I was doing my master's degree in comparative literature, in Russian and French literature, so completely different. And I wanted to be a professor and write novels, possibly, and write literary criticism. And one day I saw a photograph of an Israeli soldier burying a Palestinian teenager alive with a bulldozer of sand. And the article was about a human rights lawyer called Felicia Langer, who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, who was one of the few Israeli lawyers then defending Palestinians in military court. And it was Providence. I flew to Israel, I met her, she took me under her wing, and I feel like I went through a door that I could never go back again. And I basically couldn't finish my PhD. She said to me, if you have the ability to give a voice to people that do not have a voice, then you have an obligation. And I was just haunted by injustice and that I could, as a journalist, have some kind of impact by doing this. And then the war in Bosnia came, and that was that opened a whole other scenario for my colleagues and I.
Back to getting the book about that. But Christina, so did you grow up knowing that you were going to end up doing 28 years? 28 years you spent in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's quite amazing.
No, I mean, I also never set out to be a war correspondent. I always wanted to write. I loved writing and I wanted to have adventures. But basically, I became a war correspondent as a result of an invitation to a wedding. And what happened was I started, after I left university, I worked as an intern at the Financial Times in London. And one day, the foreign editor was supposed to be going to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go. And he said to me, "You're always going on about India. Why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went to the lunch, sat next to somebody who was Secretary General for the Pakistan People's Party, which was Benazir Bhutto's party. And he asked me if I'd like to interview Benazir, who was living in London in exile at the time. So of course I said yes. And the day that I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So the apartment was full of bouquets of flowers. And we got on very well. She was very good at charming foreign correspondents, particularly men, I think. But she then went back to Pakistan. I went to work as a trainee for a British regional TV company, where I was the most junior person and was doing kind of flower shows and things like that. And one day I came home from work and there was this absolutely beautiful gold inscribed invitation on my doormat, and it was to Benazir's wedding in Pakistan. So of course I went, and it was just the most amazing introduction to Pakistan. It was like something out of Arabian Nights. And if you've ever been to a South Asian wedding, they go on for a very long time, they're very colourful. And each evening after the ceremonial events, there were discussions about how to take on Pakistan's military dictator, General Zia. And all of her colleagues were people who had been tear-gassed and tortured and imprisoned. And the most dangerous thing I'd ever had to deal with was finding my way home after missing the last train in London. So I was fascinated. So I came back to London and said, I'm going to go and live in Pakistan. And everybody I went to talk to, all of the foreign editors, said, we're not interested in Pakistan. General Zia's been there for years. Nothing's going to change. But we are interested in Afghanistan because the Russians are there. So why don't you go and cover that? So being 21 at the time, I agreed. And the last story I ever did for British television was a man who turned his car back to front so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards. I don't think I was a great loss to British TV.
It was a wedding, so we'll go back to the Israeli, because you then went on to many other places. But Kim, tell us how your story is equally different from these two, about how you got in.
Well, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, ever since I took a journalism class when I was a sophomore in Laramie, Wyoming, and I thought, what a great con. You know, the whole idea that I could get out of class and like pull my friends out of class and ask questions and write about it, it just seemed like the greatest job in the world. So I never thought about being a foreign correspondent, though. We didn't travel anywhere. My parents, I grew up not the richest person in the world, and we never even went to Canada or Mexico growing up. We always stayed local to Wyoming and Montana. So after 9/11 happened, though, I was at the Chicago Tribune, and there were other people who were volunteering to go, and you would see like these desks sort of empty out, and this person would go try it. And I kind of felt like, not that I wanted to be a war correspondent, but that I wanted to see if I could cover the biggest story in the world. And I didn't know that I would end up falling in love with it and end up staying for so long. But I did actually volunteer for going overseas when I heard that they were going to try to send some more women overseas, because we hadn't tried out a lot of women. I think at one point I went out with a female friend, and we both wanted to go cover 9/11 and cover everything, and we counted the number of men that had been sent out and like the number of women, and it was like 17 men and 1 woman. So I wanted to also prove that a woman could do it. So I was trying to figure out how I could distinguish myself from the other female reporters that might volunteer when I heard that they were looking to send more women overseas. And I don't speak any foreign languages. I hadn't even been to Europe. But I went in with the biggest argument I had, which was I introduced myself and I said, hello, I'm Kim Barker. I'm a Metro reporter. I'm single and I'm childless, and therefore I'm expendable. Yeah, I did say that. He laughed, and I said, I'll go anywhere you want to send me. And he was just like, get ready to go to Pakistan. And I called my parents after that, and I said, I'm going to Pakistan. And they said, what? No, you're not. Why on earth would anybody send you to Pakistan? Turns out they were wrong. And then I went 4 months later.
When I got posted first to Tokyo, I called my mother, and it was a big deal. I mean, at the time, in the 90s, it was, and my mom goes, oh no, what did you do wrong at work? But let me read you something that Kim wrote in her book, and you'll get a flavor for how she writes. Afghanistan felt more like home than anywhere else in the region. I knew why. Afghanistan seemed familiar. It had jagged blue and purple mountains, big skies, and bearded men in pickup trucks stocked with guns and hate for the government. It was like Montana, just on different drugs. So let's go back to you for a second, Kim. And, it is, you have, at one point, she's talking in the book, the phone rings. Oh, the Taliban always calls at the wrong time. How do you balance kind of beheadings with stand-up comedy? I mean, you
Man,
somehow...
this is on C-SPAN, and like you just asked me the hardest question I think I've ever gotten. I mean, I think any journalist, it's just like, when you're a police officer, an emergency room doctor, anybody who has to go through trauma, anybody who grows up in Afghanistan or Pakistan, you use dark comedy to deal with horrible things. Just because you're in a war zone, just because people are being killed, doesn't mean that you stop living your life and that people stop having these small moments. And laughter, I think, it's a healer, and it's a way to bring people together. And, I guess it's also because my dad really brought me up watching MASH. It was like we didn't go to church every week. We had to watch MASH. And I was like, I hate that show. This war actually only lasted like a couple years, and this show is lasting like 25, But, and it's also like I read, I think one of the first authors I read and I really loved was Kurt Vonnegut, and then I read Joseph Heller, and I sort of like, I think, absorb that whole idea of dark comedy being a good way to talk about war and to talk about what's happened over there. And I think there really used to be a tradition of that, until there was no more draft. And then like once the draft stopped, it's like this whole idea that now that everybody doesn't know somebody who goes to war, you can't make jokes. You can't talk about like how people really live over there. It's all this sort of reverence for the idea of war and the whole idea that everybody's fighting all the time, which is just not factual.
I thought you did a brilliant job because through humor, it was like you could picture you there. and yet you were giving us so much information, and I think that's why the reviews have been through the roof about your book, so congratulations. Of course, the movie that was just made, so I have to ask, so what's Tina Fey like?
She's serious. I think I'm actually funnier. No, I'm kidding. Kidding, Tina. No, Tina is really incredibly generous. I didn't spend a lot of time with her before they ended up filming the movie, because I think there are two kinds of actors: the ones who like to spend a lot of time with somebody and sort of inhabit them, and then the ones that like to take a character and make it their own, almost like you don't want to spend any time with that person. So, I mean, we just had a long lunch, which I just remember complaining about high heels, really. I mean, we complained a lot about high heels, and then she told me a story that I told was really funny. And I was proud of myself, and I, for the life of me, couldn't remember what the story was. So I told something that made Tina Fey laugh, and I don't know what it was. And then, like, you know, when I was on set, she was really kind to me. She, and during the whole process, every single time that she was on a late night show, she would mention my name and my book, the original title, by name. And so I think my publisher was thinking that the movie tie-in that's got her face on the cover and is called Whiskey Tango Foxtrot would end up eclipsing the Taliban Shuffle because of the movie, but because she mentioned it so much, the Taliban Shuffle started selling out all the time on Amazon. So I can't say enough nice things about her. She's just been incredibly generous to me, and she's very much a supporter of women, and I really benefited from that.
Well, let's go back. You know, it used to be that there were not that many war correspondents that were female. But right now, the Washington Post actually has quite a few, and a lot of other people do too. And Alyssa Rubin just won the Pulitzer for the New York Times, covering Afghan women. But it is very different, isn't it? We'll start with Janine and just talk about how being a woman in a war zone affects reporting.
Well, when I started 25 years ago, there were very, very few women, and the women that were in the field, in my case in the Middle East, weren't very friendly to other women. I think it was because it was so competitive, it was so male, it was so driven, that there was a great sense of competition. I think now it's radically changed, but I do think I've been asked this question over and over again: do men and women report in different ways? And I think it's very individual, because what I do, I'm a human rights reporter. I go into the field. I spend a long time with people or on a certain story. I'm a terrible scoop reporter or sensationalized reporter. I'm not good at going and getting, finding the mother of the last Brit in Sierra Leone or something like that. But I need to spend a long time. And I think that we were talking earlier about the war in Bosnia. Bosnia was the watershed moment that changed reporting in our generation. I think it was basically our generation's Vietnam. And it was the time when a small group of us were very, very committed to affecting policy. And we felt that we were not going to let this genocide happen on our watch. And we stuck it out. We lived in Sarajevo during the siege with the people. We were sniped. We were shelled. We were starved. We didn't have food. We didn't have water. But yet we did something that I'm very proud of, and I feel like everyone that was in that war and covered that war feels that it changed their lives forever and their style of reporting, and we all felt very, very committed. Same thing, and that's why I want to drive Syria home right now, is it's a slow motion genocide, very similar to Sarajevo, that we were calling out must be stopped. The world must pay attention to it. Now, I live in Paris, and coming to America for the past 2 weeks on this book tour, I'm really amazed by how little attention it's getting. That, there are people being slaughtered. In Aleppo last week, the hospital where I work, Al-Quds Hospital, the only pediatrician was killed. The first responders, the white helmets, who are the bravest people in the world. We're not the bravest people in the world. They are. They go out and dig people out of the rubble. 5 of them were killed. The gynecologist who delivers the babies was killed in Aleppo.
Is it getting more play in Paris than it's getting here?
Yes. I think Europe, traditionally, there's more interest in this is an election year for America, right. And I do understand that. But I also think Syria seems so remote, but so did Bosnia. And then there was a genocide of 8,000 men and boys, and we said it would never happen again. And it is happening now.
We're going to go back to some of the atrocities, because Janine's book it's just harrowing. And just like she said, she spends a lot of time with different people, and you kind of can't, indelible images of really horrible things that happened. But back to the question, Christine, if you would pick it up about, do women bring something to correspondence, especially in war zones, that you wouldn't get if otherwise? You know, there's been lots of talk about women are different at the peacemaking table. Are they different, or do they bring something? Is there a reason we need diversity in the war correspondence?
Yeah, I think women and men report quite differently on war. I think that male war reporters tend to focus much more on the actual fighting, the bang-bang, if you like. I've covered war for 28 years, but I can tell the difference between incoming and outgoing, fortunately. But I can't really tell you very well what kind of weapons are being fired, well, where. What I focus on are the people behind the lines, the people that are living the war. Because actually, when you see war on TV, when you see Syria or places on TV, it looks like, you know, everything is fighting. When you actually go to the countries, there are millions of people still living their lives, trying to educate their children, trying to feed them and protect them. And those generally tend to be the women. So I do think that women focus on that more. And I've spent most of my career in the Middle East, and in a lot of those countries, it's impossible for male reporters to go into the women's quarters. So actually, I'm getting access to both sides in a way that a lot of my male colleagues are not.
My husband, Kevin Sullivan, spent a lot of time in war countries, and he was just saying that in some places, even the coffee shop, only the women are on one side and the men are on the other, and of course he felt cut off from a lot of the women. So it's clearly an upside, especially in Muslim countries, to have women reporters there. What are the downsides? Are there downsides, Kim?
You know, it's difficult. This question, you get this question all the time, and I've never reported as a man. So it's difficult for me to sort of...
I feel somehow you could.
It's difficult for me to sit there and say what's different. But, you know, I mean, sure, it's like there are downsides because, you know, I think with a personal life, when you're living over there, you've got to be really careful with what you're doing, you know, and there's been like books written like Emergency Sex and all this stuff. Noreen wanted me to talk about sex over there, right? Yeah. So, and you really couldn't live like that as a woman because you had to be really careful
I know
about...
there's a follow-up, but there's C-SPAN, so I don't know what to do with this, the emergency part of this. But anyway.
No, it's the book. It's a book. It has nothing to do with like anything else.
I thought it was something we needed.
No, it's nothing actually that happened. You don't have to worry about it. It's a book that came out that wrote a lot about this. But no, what I was saying is a woman over there, you had to be really protective of your reputation in a way I don't think male journalists had to. You know, you always had to be careful who you were going out with, what time you were coming home, because you were working with Afghans a lot of the times, and you had to make sure that they wanted to protect you. And so therefore, I felt like you almost had this obligation to refute the idea of being this Western loose woman, right? And that would come up a lot of times. I mean, it came up in Pakistan, it came up in India, it came up in Afghanistan. It comes up for all of us where, you know, you think you're just being friendly to people, and then you start getting phone calls in the middle of the night, and you can't turn your phone off because your editors might call, and, you know, they're calling during Ramadan, and it's 4 a.m, and it's like, I love you. And you're like, thanks, but I need some sleep. And you couldn't turn your phone off. And so it's irritations like that. It's irritations of being grabbed in public, of, I write a lot about the fact that, I mean, I'm tall, I'm 5'10", and I did punch out a lot of guys because I just got so irritated, and I would just start punching them, and that was dangerous. You know, obviously, like my fixer didn't necessarily like that because he was the guy that would get in trouble for that. And I found that, you know, the grabbing happened equally in India and Pakistan, so I don't like it when people bring religion.
How did they react to the punches?
They didn't like it.
And then they just ran away? You lift weights?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, there's
and I was like, and then there was like all this stuff with like, you know, it's funny because it's like I write about Nawaz Sharif in the book. You know, he's the current prime minister of Pakistan buying me an iPhone, and I think all of us have had similar experiences. And after the book came out, I'd have like this guy on Twitter's like, this is really unprofessional, Kim, because all of that hitting on you stuff was probably off the record. It was off the record. And I'm like, I don't think you're allowed to be off the record when you're hitting on somebody. I don't. I think that's on the record. And I also felt like it really, writing about that sort of stuff shows the level of, I'm going to pretend to be this sort of very religious man in public, but then behind the scenes, I think this is okay to behave this way with women.
It does change when you have children. That's the moment. I mean, everyone always says the difference between men and women. I always resent it when they try to say women cover orphanages and hospitals and men cover war, because I've done a lot of frontline stuff too. I'm not interested in guns, but I have done a lot of military work. But the moment that really changes for me personally was when I had a child. And that drew the line completely, because I know my male colleagues have children, and some of them used to say, now you're entering the club where you're going to read bedtime stories by satellite phone. But I do think, and I'll go, this is a risk saying this, that for women it's very different, because we carry the child, we give birth, and there was this kind of extraordinary bond. And I'll never forget when my son was 6 months old, my old paper, The Times, which is not the most sensitive paper in the world to women, my editor deliberately sent me back to Iraq, where I had been living for about 2 years covering Saddam and the invasion and the war. And I was still breastfeeding, and I didn't want to go, and I begged them not to send me, but they used a clause in my contract to send me, and they said, we've got a war reporter that won't go to war. And I said, there's nowhere that says I am a war reporter. I am a correspondent. I'm a senior foreign correspondent. I'm not a war reporter. Send me to Paris or Brussels or something. And I went, and my foreign desk was like quite a macho little scene, and the guy who was running the office said to me, he wanted me to go out and do something incredibly dangerous the first day I got there, and it would have amounted to about 2 lines in a story that was being fed in from Washington. And I said, no. And I heard him on the phone cackling to some of his friends going, DiGiovanni lost her nerve now that she had a baby. And it was so awful, but it really, I thought, and I remember getting on the phone and calling my husband and crying, and he said, but that's a good thing. Isn't it a good thing that you lost your nerve and that you're afraid? You're supposed to be afraid. You can't be the last person in the middle of bombs flying. You've got to kind of feel like a human being.
So just to be more precise,
but it was hard.
After you had your baby, what changed? Did you stop doing certain things?
I think for me, it was very personal, because I very much felt suddenly, before that, I'd worked in Africa for years and years and years, and I was very happy to embed with militias in Sierra Leone or the Ivory Coast and spend months and months and months putting myself at great risk. And I suddenly got afraid. Like, in a normal way, I didn't want to get injured.
But you've just been in Syria several times, so...
I know, it's a really conflicting thing, because as he got older, I realized that and this sounds very selfish, and some people might think I'm irresponsible, and I would not be able to argue with you about that. I mean, I feel that what I do is much more of a calling, in a sense, and I really believe in what I do, and I think it's hugely important that there are reporters that bear witness to atrocities and human rights violations. And without us, and without our eyes and ears on the ground, we don't get a window into what's happening. Do you know what's happening in Aleppo right now? You don't. And I just felt that in some way I had to make this breach, and it's been really hard. I can't say it's been easy.
And it's by story by story. Christina, why don't you pick that up, because that happens to you all the time. All of us, right? You balance work and life. But if you're, it's one thing to balance work, life, family balance when you're an insurance person in Pittsburgh. But if you're trying to manage risk and going to just about the world's most dangerous places, which all of you have been repeatedly, how do you balance? Is this story worth it? You have a son too, and a family.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. It's I think, obviously, once you're responsible for a child and you're a mother, you have to think about that first. And so I don't go to places where I know that I'm going to be in crazy risk. And I think one of the things you learn about this job is actually the most dangerous things that have ever happened to me, being ambushed or being in suicide bombs, have often been in places which weren't supposed to be dangerous. So it's actually very difficult to plan this. And look, we see these days you can be blown up in Brussels, in Paris, in anywhere. So, it is, I think, difficult sort of balance. But I definitely, since I've become a mother, which is 16 years now, I am much more careful at where I go. And I think you feel a bit differently because you meet mothers and who are going through terrible things, whose children are being attacked, and you can identify with them much more than when you weren't a mother. So, and it's very hard sometimes to live with that.
Yesterday was Mother's Day, and I tweeted, this is for all the mothers in war zones, that are trying to keep their families together, because they're so impressive, women trying to raise children in the middle of war.
I have friends at the State Department who are all Skyping from very dangerous places yesterday. They're friends. So, Miss Expendable, how do you feel about danger?
I was a chicken. I mean, I didn't need to have a kid to value my life. I love this argument that you're supposed to somehow change after you have children, as if your life's not important before that. And like...
How important is your life?
It's very important to me. It's probably the most important thing to me. And like I have parents, and I also, more importantly, had a fixer and a driver, and for me, after what happened to Ajmal Naqshbandi in Afghanistan, when his head was cut off, after they were kidnapped, him and an Italian journalist were kidnapped by the Taliban, and the journalist was released and left Ajmal behind, and Ajmal was killed. I was like, yeah, we don't need to do those things if you feel like they're dangerous, Farouk. And there's no story. I wasn't the sort of person who's like, oh, I'm going to go out in the middle of the countryside and meet the Taliban. And those reporters are great. They're probably better reporters than I am. I was happy to go to jail and meet the Taliban who had just been arrested because they had been arrested. And I was happy to have them come to meet me inside cities at hotels, because there was like a string of times where, friends of mine would be like, I'm going to go meet the Taliban. I'm like, and you're going to get kidnapped. And it would happen. I mean, it was
a case-by-case thing that we all have to deal with, and it's a good point. And if the story is the same, when you can talk to somebody behind bars, it's very different. But if you want to be eyewitnesses, Janine's going to talk about in a minute, sometimes you can't just go to jail, as you know. But I think what's interesting is that for all of you, different things triggered why you went there. Then you got there and you got hooked. And I just want to read a passage from Christina's book that is towards the end of her book. It's called War Never Leaves You. And November 2014, of course, in the end, I went back. I missed Afghanistan with the yearning that I could not explain. I had an adorable clapboard house in Washington with a rocking chair on the porch and a white picket fence, where every day a yellow school bus came to collect my son, just like in the American movies. And I had a great job and wonderful friends. Yet part of me was somewhere else entirely, dreaming of pomegranate pips shining red as rubies. If I drove through Rock Creek Park with my roof down, the scent of pines reminded me of the mountains in Paktia. In my big American house, I had a walk-in wardrobe, its shelves piled with silk scarves in bright colors like magenta, pink, and peacock blue, each one with a memory. And you went on from there about how you had to go back because it was just always in your senses. You missed sitting on the village floors drinking green tea and listening to fantastical stories of ancient feuds. I never remembered the bad bits. So is it that you... Like childbirth. Right? Is it like childbirth? You just kind of, okay, I mean, a lot of bad things happened. You lost friends, colleagues, people you knew, and yet you kept going back.
I think when you keep going to the same place over and over again, it's not a story. You know the people there. You don't think of it as an issue, or it is. You think about all the people that you know there and what's happening to them, and you want people to know about it. I mean, one of the things I feel very angry about at the moment is the way that people are sort of accepting that from our politicians that the war in Afghanistan is over because we declared it over a couple of years ago. In fact, more people were killed in Afghanistan than any year of the war. And what makes me most angry is the situation of the women there, because you remember that when the Taliban were toppled, the discussion was, now we're going to make women free. And Laura Bush and Sherry Blair and people gave radio addresses and talked about it. Actually, we encouraged women in Afghanistan to do all sorts of things they would never have otherwise done, run for office, become security guards, doing all sorts of things, which is good. But now we've just left those people behind and we're not protecting them. And they stood up and have done things that were not traditional in their culture, and now they're being targeted and we're not there to help them. And I think we have a moral responsibility to do something about that. So I feel really passionately that we shouldn't forget that.
And once you're so deep in a story, you feel a responsibility to let the world know. So in Janine's book, she writes these indelible images of things, and it was touched by this one passage in Janine's book. When my son was born shortly after the American occupation of Iraq, I was unable to cut his nails. It was visceral rather than rational reaction. I would pick up the tiny baby scissors and look at his translucent fingers, clean and pink as seashells, and feel as though I would retch. I had a vision of an Iraqi man I knew who had no fingernails. And then it goes on at length about this man who used to come into your office in Iraq who had been tortured and all his fingernails taken off, and how every time you saw your baby. And it's incredible. You, like you started saying, you met these people, stayed close to them, and wrote horrific things. So what draws you? I mean, Syria right now is just about the most dangerous place on earth. We've all lost friends there. Are you going to go back, Janine?
Well, I feel very committed to it. And I also feel that last week after Al-Quds Hospital was bombed, the attacks on medical workers, I find absolutely horrific. And so I feel the need, and it's not a pull. It's interesting because I do have friends who I would say are addicted to war, and they clearly are addicted. They like the adrenaline. They like the fact that they're taken out of their ordinary, boring day-to-day lives where we have to pay bills and drive kids to school, and they go into a war zone where you very much live in the moment because you're trying to stay alive. But I don't think I was ever like that. I think for me it was much more about something Martha Gellhorn said many years ago, which was, you have one war that you fall in love with, the rest is responsibility. And I think, again, Bosnia did that to me, and now Syria, I've fallen in love again. And I do feel very committed to it in the way that the people I've spent so much time with. And a lot of what I do is I write about human rights violations, so rape and torture, which is very hard to report. And the only way you could do it is by spending huge amounts of time with people and gaining their trust. You can't just fly in, get a quick story and get out. You need to sit on the floor with them for weeks. Sometimes I've spent months in Kosovo working with just one village of women, an entire village that had been raped. And I worked actually with Human Rights Watch. So it was, we did a very kind of quantitative research and gathering data. And it's heartbreaking. I once learned in a first aid class that if someone ever gets hit by shrapnel, you can't pull the piece of whatever it is out of their body because they'll bleed to death. You have to staunch it and sustain it. And I feel often when I'm interviewing someone who's been deeply, deeply traumatized, you can't just go in and pull things out of them. You just have to sit and you wait and you listen and gradually the story emerges, or it might not. They might not want to talk to you.
I was just saying this story that we wrote about the girls in Cleveland who had been held in the basement for 10 years. It took a year before the youngest one would start talking.
You just need patience.
So I'm sorry, we're going to go to the audience for some questions, and then I do want you to, if anybody has, they can raise their hand, and we have a mic out there, if anybody. We have someone here in the front.
Stan. Good evening. You mentioned earlier, Janine, and others have referred to it, that the reaction to your stories and the change that it could affect or not. In Bosnia, it took Srebrenica before it forced the world to act. And is that what it takes, a huge incident like that, or is the reporting being just ignored until that moment occurs?
Let's talk about the consequences, intended or not, of reporting. It's a good question. Either intended or not.
It's not humanitarian intervention anymore. I mean, we lived in Bosnia and Rwanda were more the times of humanitarian intervention, and it was much more a time of empathy and compassion. I mean, I think we have a very different administration right now. And I think most of us do write to affect policy in some way. I mean, that's our role, essentially, is to shine a light in the darkest corners. But whether or not we can do it and whether or not we can reach policymakers is kind of beyond us. But ultimately, that's our goal, to get resolutions made and international law to be honored and transitional justice to happen and accountability. I mean, that's the main thing I work for. I don't want these guys that rape and torture and kill and murder to have impunity. I want them to pay. I want them to end up in seeking or getting justice served to them. So I think that's the real reason.
And it's not always geared towards policymakers, but like in Vietnam, which is the classic example, it was geared towards telling the public what was happening on the ground. But an enormous role that war correspondents have is to let, even if Capitol Hill or policymakers are not listening, that the public is.
It shouldn't take a Srebrenica, should it really? But I think one of the problems now is we've had so many wars over the last few years of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. People are a bit inured to all of this. It's difficult to actually shock people anymore, and I think people are tired of it all and wish it would all go away. Frankly, Afghanistan in the UK gets almost no coverage now because I think people or newspapers are battling because there's so many wars going on. And it's also become much more dangerous to cover them. I mean, there's two big changes since I started out. One is the technology, which has made it a lot easier so that we can file from stories from the top of a mountain or the middle of a desert. When I started out, Afghanistan didn't even have a telephone system, so I was going into Afghanistan for weeks and only being able to call back my stories when I went back to Pakistan. Even then, there was no direct dialing. There was telex, if you remember that, or I was dictating to copy takers in London, which is quite a difficult thing to do because you're dictating a long story and you've got someone at the other end saying to you, is there much more of this? So that side's become a lot easier, the technology. The other side that's become much harder is that it's become much more dangerous. We've become targets in a way we weren't when I started out. And I find it very frustrating that there are places that we can't go to and report from because it's become so dangerous. And that is something I never thought I would say 10 or 20 years ago. I just can't go there because it's too dangerous.
I think it's also that the nature of the news business has changed so much, in the last 10 or 15 years, as we've been going through these wars, and there's just so much information out there. And it's not like people feel like they have to read the entire Washington Post or the New York Times or the Sunday Times to get their news. They pick and choose what they want to read. So a lot of times you even have stories that are out there. I remember when there was a controversy of there were bombings on days in Europe and in Pakistan at the same time, and there was people complaining that, no one was covering the Pakistani bombings the same way they were covering the ones in Europe. And it turns out like somebody studied readership of the stories that were actually done, and nobody read those stories that were done about the bombings in Pakistan. because people don't care, and that's, I think, the biggest challenge that we face right now, is that everybody only wants to read stories that reinforce their own political beliefs and that cover areas that interest them. And the way that the newspapers used to be, and we're never going to go back there, is you would read everything, Except for the woman in the front row who reads everything.
Hi, sorry. I actually lived in Syria from 2009 to 2011, so Janine, my question isn't particular for you, but I'm interested in, okay, should I repeat what I was saying, or, okay. I'm a writer and editor, and I actually lived in Syria from 2009 to 2011. And I was interested, and I visited Bosnia as well, and I was interested if you could talk a little bit more about the public's reaction to what was going on to Bosnia at the time, and if you see the reaction now more as a product of sort of latent Orientalism or latent racism, and if this was a matter more of geographic distance and that kind of separation, and then equally what Syria can learn from post-war Bosnia. I wouldn't call it post-peace Bosnia, but in looking ahead to a transition state, what kind of lessons can we learn from that?
So two really, really good questions. Okay, I'll try. The first one, when I was reporting Sarajevo, I worked for the Sunday Times, which at that point I was battling against Princess Diana and Prince Charles to get in the paper. Seriously. And I had this horrible foreign editor who took, he just said, people are bored by this. People are bored by this. And it came to one point where, do you remember Romeo and Juliet in Bosnia, the couple, a Muslim and a Serb, who ran away to get married and were killed on a bridge, and he wasn't interested because Princess Diana had done something and didn't run the story, and then of course it became the icon of Sarajevo. So it was a real struggle, and it was very frustrating, but I think we just felt like we're going to keep going, we're going to keep pushing it. And what I would do is they would send me from London and they'd say, you're going to go for 6 weeks, and I wouldn't come home. And in those days, there weren't cell phones, so they couldn't find me. And I would just disappear and go off and investigate. I'd go towards Focha and investigate the rape camps. But it was hugely frustrating. Your question about racism is so interesting, because while Bosnia was happening, and we felt that we were being ignored, even though Sarajevo, if there were flights, was only 3 hours from London by plane, the Rwandan genocide was breaking out in 1994. By the time my foreign desk sent me there, it was May. It had started in April. And I think that one of the reasons that there was that it was not only covered properly, but that the genocide was allowed to continue, was because there were so few journalists there who could then get there. I think that had they been there, I don't think 1 million people would have been killed. I think in some way it could have been halted. Lessons learned. We should talk after the event, because I just wrote a thesis for the Fletcher School about the lessons learned from Bosnia onto the Syrian war. I mean, mainly, let's hope and pray they don't partition Syria, because we see what a disaster Bosnia is now. 25 years after Dayton, it stopped the killing, but it's contributed to the rise of nationalism, sectarianism that never existed before, and I don't want to see that happen to Syria. But we can talk after.
I guess my question is, how do you get to see in a war what you want to see? Because the fact is that there was just a bunch of reporters in Syria on like a government tour, and it wasn't dangerous for them at all. But I guess, like, how do you get to see both sides in a war without subjecting yourself to like huge personal risk?
I think you're only ever seeing a fragment of what's going on. You can't ever see the war in general. Like I was saying, Afghanistan years ago, when you went for weeks and weeks, when you came back to write a story, you were pretty well informed then. These days, because of technology, we're expected to write immediately and report. And so you can only really genuinely report on where you are at that particular time. You don't know what's going on elsewhere. And in fact, during the war in Iraq, when I came back, I was in southern Iraq and then went to Baghdad. And I felt like I'd missed some of the war by being there, because everyone that had watched it at home had seen all these things on TV and were talking about all this stuff, and I didn't know anything about it. So, and I think, it's dangerous when journalists on the spot try and generalize about places when actually they can't see much more than what they're seeing. There's a big debate about sort of embedding with troops and, whether that's the right thing to do. And I used to be against doing that, because I thought you should go as an independent. And the war in Iraq, I was there as what we would call unilaterals, where you weren't attached to anybody. But actually, that reporting on your country's troops and what they're doing is part of the story. And I think the important thing is to try and do both sides. Same with Syria. If you can go with the regime and see what they're showing, but you can also go independently and into rebel-held areas or other areas, then you're getting a much more balanced picture. It's difficult to do that. Often countries don't let you go in if they know that you've reported with the fighters.
And what do you think about embedding? You embedded.
Yeah, I embedded. I feel the same way that Christina did, or does now, but I always, I hadn't done the unilateral stuff before, and I didn't go on very many embeds. I think I went on maybe 6 to 8, something like that, over the 5 years I lived over there.
How long were you with them each time?
A week or two, but I found I realized pretty quickly when I went out on one embed, and this guy said to me, at night, be sure to take your photographer with you. Photographers, by the way, love it when you say your photographer, because it implies like they're your pet. But so they say, be sure to take your photographer with you when you go to the bathroom at night, because there are only 3 women on the base. And I just was, I said, well, you're not going to send me anywhere, are you, if you think that I'm going to face an issue on the base going to the bathroom at night? And I found a lot of times, and I talked to a lot of folks in the military about this, when I would hang around them longer, do you send women out on the more dangerous, missions? Would you send me out to Korangal, which was the most dangerous area at that point? And they just sort of said, we might send you there, but we wouldn't send you on the more dangerous patrols, because we worry that, and it's largely men who are in the military, will want to protect you, as opposed to the male reporters or photographers. They sort of feel like, it's up to them if they're going to go. So I could see his point. So I think that when I went out on embeds, I got stories of these guys who would tell me about broken marriages, about the fact that they hadn't seen their kids in so long, about more like what it was like to have these constant deployments. And then, of course, I wrote a story that after the story where guys kept telling me that they were not locked and loaded, they ended up getting moved to another more dangerous place because of what they had told me. And, the main guy in my story ended up getting blown up in an IED explosion and losing his leg. And I didn't find that out until after I came back. And I wonder if I'd known about that when I was over there, if it would have made me pull my punches more on embeds, because I think that is a danger when you're on an embed, that you're going to do stories that you want the troops to like, because you're with them so much. And so when I was there, I always tried to make sure that I just am going to do the story that I see here. I'm not going to worry about whether anybody likes me afterwards. And I can't deny that when I found that out after I came back, that I felt really horrible, obviously, even though,
So what do you do about that? The consequences of reporting. How do you deal with that?
Because I think you were asking particularly about Syria, which Damascus, to get visas to the regime side, which the New York Times just did, it's actually, to be honest, initially in the beginning of the war, I got 5 or 6. It's really paranoid making. It's not dangerous the way it is to go on the other side through Turkey or through Lebanon with the opposition, but you are incredibly paranoid. And when you're with government minders, or especially Syria, whenever you work in a regime, or I was just in Iran, or even I was in Egypt last week, there's a different kind of danger, and that is that you're going to be taken away and put in prison. Or killed in a place where security services have absolutely no qualms about taking foreigners, like the Italian student who was just killed in Egypt and killing you, you're not in danger of bombs and sniping, but it's quite spooky. I mean, I've been probably the most spooked I've been in a long time in Damascus, knowing that I was being bugged and followed and every email was being read. It's very unnerving.
Janine does a smart thing, I thought a very clever part of the book, when she talks about taking a $100 taxi ride from Beirut to Damascus, kind of just to set it in the reader's mind that it is pretty close, and yet you cross the border and everything changes and it gets pretty dangerous pretty quickly, and yet it's right there in the center of everything.
Different kind of danger. Like
and I think all three of these books, I mean, it is amazing where Christina talks about all these people that are in the news. You know, Christina's basically interviewed every single one of them, as all of you guys have, and they have this wonderful personal touch. And, you know, the way you describe things, and also to put yourself in. And Kim's genius, you know, she's talking about boyfriend's calling, and she's like, you know, I'd rather go to Afghanistan.
What was I thinking?
I'd rather go to Afghanistan. I was wondering, you didn't name that guy, but how did he take that?
That guy, the guy.
Did you name him? Full last name?
I didn't put his last name,
You
and I gave him a
didn't? No
pseudonym.
last name.
Oh, he was, I mean, like, we're still friends. I mean, I got buy-in from everybody who was in the book. They got what I was doing. I'm supposed to come off unlikable in points, and I'm supposed to be the foil for America going into this country that it knew nothing about. I'm supposed to come off as naive and arrogant, and just like America does. And, you know, Farouk is supposed to be Afghanistan, who's like in it in the beginning, but at a certain point gets a sense that I'm going to leave, and so is going to get as much money as he can. You know, who could blame him?
We have time for one more question.
Kim, you brought up Joseph Heller before, and there's a scene in Catch-22 when the pilots are talking to each other, and one of them says, I want to have a long life, and the other one asks why, and the answer is, well, what else is there? I imagine that the three of you know full well what else is there, that there's no guarantee for a long life. So for the three of you, whether for that risk, or for, frankly, the apathy of your readers or your editors, have you ever thought about stopping? You ever thought about, no, this isn't worth it anymore, that there's something else to do, or no, have you just kept going? Thanks.
I mean, I stopped. I might go back. I mean, I could see going back, and I feel like every day I make the choice to stay here. And it's a difficult choice to make, because I miss being in Afghanistan. I miss being in Pakistan. I miss living in the middle of the story and having conversations at night that are about the future of countries, and feeling like you're actually seeing a country change and watching a democracy get built. I miss that feeling. But, you know, I decided to see if I could live normal. I mean, as normal as any journalist is. And I'm a Metro reporter now in New York, you know. Then that's what I do, and we'll see how long that lasts, but for right now it's working.
I think the problem is that the wars don't end. One of the sort of arguments in my book is we don't know how to end wars anymore. I wish Afghanistan would end so I could kind of go there on holiday with my son. I wish Libya and Iraq and the other places I cover would end. And you asked if I'd ever thought of stopping. Well, when I had my son in 1999, I did think I was going to stop doing what I was doing. I write books, other kind of books, as well as this war book. And so I thought I would stop. I had 6 months off from my newspaper to research a book. And my husband's Portuguese, and we moved to Portugal the day before September 11th for me to start writing this book. And the first day that I started writing was September 11th. I got a phone call. And I often wonder, if it hadn't been Afghanistan where bin Laden was, would I have gone back? If it had been Iraq or somewhere which I didn't have the same kind of background in. But Afghanistan, because it was my first story and I cared so much about it, was almost like sort of your first love affair, I think. And there was no way I wasn't going to go back. And also I'd been angry that people had forgotten about it after the Russians left. So there was no thought of not doing it.
I think about stopping every day and what else I could do. And one thing I did do is in 2014, I went to work for the UN for a year because I've spent my entire career criticizing and going after the UN and taking them to pieces. And I just thought I wanted to work for the UN Refugee Agency, which is probably of all of them the best of the lot, on the Syria crisis. I wanted to see from that perspective, and I also wanted to gain more insight into going deeper with research. And the year after that, I was given a fellowship from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy to do another degree in international law. And I did that because I just feel like if I'm going to spend my life researching human rights, I really need to have a basis in law, in which I had gained from the field, but I needed to go deeper. And I just graduated in March, and I think all the time, you know, can I go work for a bank now? Can I go work for Morgan Stanley? Can I go work for the British government, the French government, the State Department? I am no way addicted to being in the field, but I do feel that we have skills that, you know, we've gained over the years that are important, and they're vital. And I think that we have something that we need to contribute. At the same time, we need to stay alive. And after I was in Grozny when it fell to Russian forces in 2000, it was the closest I've ever come to dying. And my husband at the time said to me, the best journalist is the one who gets out alive to tell the story. And it's true, we're worth absolutely nothing if we get killed or if we're maimed. So it's that constant, we're not insane, we're not crazy. We have a role, and I think we do it well. And I think that, you know, Martha Gellhorn did it till she was well into her 90s. I don't want to be into my 90s doing it, but I think that, you know, there is something we do that's quite noble.
Can I just say something about it?
Sure.
I think, Janine and I are making it sound like it's all misery, and actually, you know, you have fun too. And that's what Kim really described so well, that you wouldn't keep going to these places if all it was relentless misery. A week ago, I was at the most wonderful Kurdish wedding on the border between Turkey and Syria. All those people there had fled Syria, had terrible stories, didn't know when they would see their home again. But they had fun that night. They really made a lot of effort to enjoy the wedding, to show their children the Kurdish dancing and music. And, you know, you could forget just for a few hours the misery of what was happening to their home, just, you know, less than an hour's drive away. And I think one of the weirdest things that ever happened to me, which brought this home to me, after Benazir was killed in Pakistan, she was a good friend of mine, and I thought, how is Pakistan going to survive this? And there was kind of riots in her home province of Sindh, and people talked about Pakistan breaking up and all of this sort of apocalyptic stuff. And I arrived at the airport and got a taxi driver, and journalists notoriously always ask the taxi driver what's going on. And and he said, oh, it's very grim, everything's very bad. So I said, yeah, you know, Benazir's death and everything. And he said to me, no, we have no discos. And I said, what? And he said to me, we don't have any discos in Pakistan.
I was 14 years a foreign correspondent, and it's so true what they say. It's all about high highs and low lows. And when you come back after all these high highs, you kind of forget the low lows. And for you guys and even myself, we've lost colleagues and gotten killed. I mean, the lows are low, but the highs are super high. And then at some point you come back and you're kind of happy to just do the middle. But it's never like it is when you're abroad, right?
You speak to the value of camaraderie, and I noticed that every answer to every question you reference others. I mean, other people you've met, people at the wedding, photographers. Talk a little bit about the value of solidarity when covering these conflicts, and particularly among women, because you two really exemplify that camaraderie and that sisters in arms mentality that I think exists when one works overseas.
I think it's really important important because there are still very few of us women in the field doing this kind of work. And so I think it is very important that we stick up for each other and that that there is solidarity between us. And I was a bit surprised by Janine saying at the beginning that she didn't find that, because I have always found other women.
Way back in the late 80s, early 90s.
And I think, the most upsetting thing as a woman correspondent, as a mother, is when other women attack you for what you do, because it isn't easy.
But there are, I mentor young women all the time now because I wasn't mentored, because there weren't older women that supported me. And now I have interns all the time, I have young women, I try to make them, I would never say to someone, all the time young people say to me, is it worth becoming a journalist? And I say, yes, absolutely. It's the greatest job in the world. So I do think there's solidarity, absolutely.
It's funny because people watch the movie, and friends of mine before the movie was coming out, they're saying, hey, is that Tanya Vanderpool, Margot Robbie's character, is that based on me? And I said, no, because you're not that pretty, and also you're nice, and because it's like we just had this group of people, and some of them are in the audience actually, who all just helped each other, and we would always make sure that everybody was taken care of. You talk about stories. I just felt I would have done anything, and I'd still do anything to help the female reporters I worked with over there. And what's nice is, like, when you have that, you're sort of in this. You're sort of, you can call it the kabubble, you can call it whatever, but you're in this sort of zone where you will be friends for life. And we barely met each other over there, but I think that we've got all the similar sort of. She was saying answers, and I'm like, that's what I usually say, So.
But also between different news organizations, in dangerous places, people really do bond together, and it's a great question about solidarity, because when you're out there, you do. In a way normally, that especially in this town, that there's a lot of competition, in many ways it disappears. Wouldn't you agree?
Working with Christina in the United States when she was here as the DC bureau chief for the Sunday Times, she was really one of the most collegial and sharing reporters that I've ever worked with, bar none.
Thanks. All right, we have one last question, and then we can stay and talk.
Well, thank you. I'm not entirely sure how to ask this question, but I want to follow up on a couple of points that you made. You said, why are we not paying more attention to what's going on in Aleppo? And you said that we're really inured to so much of this conflict now that it just kind of rolls off of us, and it really kind of does. And one of the reasons that I was really looking forward to tonight, I figured collectively your experiences are amazing, and they are. But for those of us that are trying to keep up, there are so many different players, and there's so many different conflicts, and then the external players, Russia, the United States, Europe, Saudi Arabia. It all seems pretty hopeless. And so I'm just curious. You said the highs and the highs and the lows and the lows. Where is there hope for all of this to somehow or other get sorted out? Or what is your sense of this?
It's incredibly complicated, and don't feel ignorant, because I literally have to, and I've studied the Middle East for 25 years, to sit down and draw graphs and put markers and try to put things on maps and identify who's fighting who. There's 1,000 militias fighting on the opposition, on the Syrian opposition right now. And that's not even taking into the international players, Russia, Qatar, Saudi, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, goes on and on, the U.S. All I could say is that, wars do end. They eventually do end when the players on the battlefield become exhausted. And at this stage now, it's gearing up. I don't think Syria is going to go into a 17-year war like Lebanon. I do think that it will eventually come to a head in one way or another. I just wish it would be sooner rather than later, and we don't have to wait for it to be 400,000 people dead, because that's what your question earlier about Srebrenica. In 1992, we started calling out for it, and we had to wait until the end of 1995 when 8,000 men and boys were killed. So I don't think we want to wait until there's a genocide. And I think that, President Obama made a decision, a very tactical decision in 2013, that he did not want to get engaged in a third Middle Eastern war because he was elected on a platform to get out of wars. And, Doing that policy of nonchalance has had a great cost, and that was the rise of ISIS. They didn't come out of nowhere. They've been around, and it's the result of the failure in Iraq, and it's the result of our own policy of not paying enough attention. If I saw ISIS on the ground in 2012, why was the world so surprised when Mosul finally fell? So I think in some way we have to have accountability as well, because we allowed our compassion to become fatigued. And that's always a very, very dangerous thing for us to become complacent. And I think that's why I write what I do, is I really want people to be upset. I want them to be shook up. It's not easy to read, but it's the truth. And I think it's important that we digest it.
A lot of these things are a result of short-term thinking and short-term decisions. We care about what's happening now. So actually you can track ISIS back to the jihad in Afghanistan against the Russians, when all our focus was defeating the Russians in the Cold War, and we didn't care how we did it. So we brought people from Arab countries who were criminals or gangsters or Salafists and encouraged them to come and fight, because our only interest was defeating the Russians. And I think that's one of the things I find hardest in the job, that you keep seeing the same mistakes being made over and over again, and you kind of feel like, don't we ever learn? Look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. Every single one, the easy thing is removing the regime. That's not difficult with our militaries, but what do you do then? And in each one, we haven't had a plan for what to do afterwards. So, just to go back to your question, it is really complicated, and it's so complicated that we're on the same side as some countries in one place and on different sides to them in other places. But the reason I keep doing this is that where you find hope is in the people. I'm endlessly amazed at how people, in the midst of all these difficult situations, still keep really focused on, in particular, trying to educate their children. And I was lucky enough to work with Malala on her book. And, she is so inspiring. She risked her life to be able to go to school, and for the sake of other children to go to school. And when you meet people like that and you can tell their story, it makes it all worth it.
Last word, Kim.
Well, I don't think I could do this job if I didn't feel hope. Right, even for Afghanistan, and I'll give an entire hour speech about how things are going horribly in Afghanistan, and somebody will say, "Well, then what shouldn't we just pull everybody home?" And no, you've got the wrong point. I feel like what you were saying is exactly the same sort of things. Like, we do have a chance there. And there have been improvements there. Just the very fact of having cell phone coverage now in Afghanistan, of having the internet there, of having TV stations like Tolo there that do reality TV shows where Afghan women now feel so empowered that they will do presentations, sing with their hair and rock out. This one woman on International Women's Day on, Afghan Star, I watched her performance and I was like, you are the bravest feminist I've ever seen. So there are positive things happening there. And I think that you try to hold on to those. And the whole idea that if we just walk away now and we don't actually give the country stability enough for the next generation to take over would be the biggest mistake. And also, look, it's today. We're looking around saying the world's falling apart, the world's falling apart. Look at 30 years ago, look at 60 years ago. You can go back through generations. World War II was no picnic. So, we just happen to know more about it now because of the internet, because of all the news. So I guess I would just say, there is hope in every place you're looking at.
Well, it's a long, important, and complicated discussion about where America and Britain and the Western world goes with Syria, what their obligations are, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. But tonight, I thought, was a very special night to talk to three women who, kind of a look behind the news and the people. You guys have done an amazing job with these three books. And as Janine says, writing to shake things up. Their books shake things up, their stories. And I'm grateful that tonight you kind of helped us know who you are a little bit and kind of why you do what you do. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
But we are interested in Afghanistan because the Russians are there. So why don't you go and cover that? So being 21 at the time, I agreed. And the last story I ever did for British television was a man who turned his car back to front so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards. I don't think I was a great loss to British TV.
It was a wedding, so we'll go back to the Israeli, because you then went on to many other places. But Kim, tell us how your story is equally different from these two, about how you got in.
Well, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, ever since I took a journalism class when I was a sophomore in Laramie, Wyoming, and I thought, what a great con, you know, the whole idea that I could get out of class and like pull my friends out of class and ask questions and write about it. It just seemed like the greatest job in the world. So I never thought about being a foreign correspondent, though. We didn't travel anywhere. My parents, I grew up not the richest person in the world, and we never even went to Canada or Mexico growing up. We always stayed local to Wyoming and Montana. So after 9/11 happened, though, I was at the Chicago Tribune, and there were other people who were volunteering to go, and you would see like these desks sort of empty out, and you know, this person would go try it. And I kind of felt like, not that I wanted to be a war correspondent, but that I wanted to see if I could cover the biggest story in the world. And I didn't know that I would end up falling in love with it and end up staying for so long. But I did actually volunteer for going overseas when I heard that they were going to try to send some more women overseas, because we hadn't tried out a lot of women. I think at one point I went out with a female friend, and we both wanted to go cover 9/11 and cover everything, and we counted the number of men that had been sent out and like the number of women, and it was like 17 men and 1 woman. So I wanted to also prove that a woman could do it. So I was trying to figure out how I could distinguish myself from the other female reporters that might volunteer when I heard that they were looking to send more women overseas. And I don't speak any foreign languages. I hadn't even been to Europe. But I went in with the biggest argument I had, which was I introduced myself and I said, hello, I'm Kim Barker. I'm a Metro reporter. I'm single and I'm childless.
We have a very special program for you this evening. Not one, but 3 very fine authors, all journalists, all seasoned, intrepid war reporters. They've written memoirs and are here to discuss their experiences in Afghanistan, Syria, and other conflict zones. First, at my far right is Janine DiGiovanni, Newsweek's Middle East editor and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. At the start of her journalistic career, Janine covered the first Palestinian Intifada in the late 1990s. Since then, in the 1980s, I had 1980s, I don't know why I said 1990s. Since then, she's reported on turmoil and civil conflicts throughout the Middle East and beyond. In her latest book, The Morning They Came for Us, she chronicles the war in Syria. Using 7 different perspectives, she provides a vivid picture of a ravaged nation as experienced by its citizens. Among them, a nun, a doctor, a musician, and a student. Their stories convey the realities of modern urban warfare, from the pervasive smoke to the hunger, to the return of such previously vanquished diseases as typhus and polio. Next to Janine is Christina Lamb, currently the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times. Like Janine, Christina's introduction to conflict reporting also came in the late 1980s, but in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Her journalism has since taken her far and wide, including assignments in Brazil, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Iraq. But since the 9/11 attacks, she's spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan. She wrote I Am Malala, or co-wrote I Am Malala, with Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai. And her new book, Farewell Kabul, highlights the errors and miscalculations made by the United States and its allies in the war in Afghanistan, and argues that the world has been left more, not less, dangerous since 9/11. Our third author is Kim Barker, whose book, The Taliban Shuffle, about her reporting in Afghanistan and Pakistan, served as the basis for the recent movie Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, starring Tina Fey. Kim's first reporting jobs were with papers in Indiana and Washington State. After joining the Chicago Tribune in 2001, she ended up going abroad and spent 5 years from 2004 to 2009 as the Trib's South Asia bureau chief based in New Delhi and Islamabad. She now writes for the New York Times. A Times review of her book called it both hilarious and harrowing, two contrasting adjectives that also sum up the frequently mixed experience of war reporting. Moderating discussion by this impressive group of panelists will be Mary Jordan, herself a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with The Washington Post. Mary was based abroad for 14 years in Tokyo, Mexico City, and London, and she's currently covering the presidential campaign. You need that foreign experience.
War reporting is easier.
She told me as we were walking in that she just interviewed Donald Trump today, so you might want to ask her about that. Anyway, we're sort of getting off track, aren't we? Mary's most recent book, which she co-wrote with her husband, Kevin Sullivan, also of The Washington Post, is titled Hope, a Memoir of Survival in Cleveland, and chronicle the kidnapping and torment of two of the women held captive in a home in Cleveland by Ariel Castro. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, I really feel like I'm having dinner at 3 different 5-star restaurants.
No, I mean, I also never set out to be a war correspondent. I always wanted to write. I loved writing and I wanted to have adventures. But basically, I became a war correspondent as a result of an invitation to a wedding. And what happened was I started, after I left university, I worked as an intern at the Financial Times in London. And one day, the foreign editor was supposed to be going to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go. And he said to me, "You're always going on about India. Why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went to the lunch, sat next to somebody who was Secretary General for the Pakistan People's Party, which was Benazir Bhutto's party. And he asked me if I'd like to interview Benazir, who was living in London in exile at the time. So of course I said yes. And the day that I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So the apartment was full of bouquets of flowers. And we got on very well. She was very good at charming foreign correspondents, particularly men, I think. But she then went back to Pakistan. I went to work as a trainee for a British regional TV company, where I was the most junior person and was doing kind of flower shows and things like that. And one day I came home from work and there was this absolutely beautiful gold inscribed invitation on my doormat, and it was to Benazir's wedding in Pakistan. So of course I went, and it was just the most amazing introduction to Pakistan. It was like something out of Arabian Nights. I mean, if you've ever been to a South Asian wedding, they go on for a very long time, they're very colourful. And each evening after the ceremonial events, there were discussions about how to take on Pakistan's military dictator, General Zia. And all of her colleagues were people who had been tear-gassed and tortured and imprisoned. And the most dangerous thing I'd ever had to deal with was finding my way home after missing the last train in London. So I was fascinated. So I came back to London and said, I'm going to go and live in Pakistan. And everybody I went to talk to, all of the foreign editors, said, we're not interested in Pakistan. General Zia's been there for years. Nothing's going to change.
It's impossible to do justice to the careers of these 3 women, but we're sure going to have fun trying. And I see in the audience Bill Kovitz, one of the great newsmen of our time and the former head of the Neiman Foundation for Journalists. And it's a testament to, is this working?
Yeah, it's working.
It's a testament to all the work that you've done. I'm very proud to be up here on the stage. So I want to ask first, before we get into other things, how did this happen? You know, other kids grow up and they want to run Facebook. Why did you want to go to war? You want to start?
Yeah, well, I never wanted to be a journalist. I was an academic, and I was doing my master's degree in comparative literature, in Russian and French literature, so completely different. And I wanted to be a professor and write novels, possibly, and write literary criticism. And one day I saw a photograph of an Israeli soldier burying a Palestinian teenager alive with a bulldozer of sand. And the article was about a human rights lawyer called Felicia Langer, who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, who was one of the few Israeli lawyers then defending Palestinians in military court. And it was Providence. I flew to Israel, I met her, she took me under her wing, and I feel like I went through a door that I could never go back again. And I basically couldn't finish my PhD. She said to me, if you have the ability to give a voice to people that do not have a voice, then you have an obligation. And I was just haunted by injustice and that I could, as a journalist, have some kind of impact by doing this. And then the war in Bosnia came, and that was that opened a whole other scenario for my colleagues and I.
Back to getting the book about that. But Christina, so did you grow up knowing that you were going to end up doing 28 years? 28 years you spent in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's quite amazing.